There is a quiet longing, a tenderness found not in grand gestures, but in the small, deliberate choices two souls make to mend their solitary lives. It begins, as all true things do, with a silence waiting to be filled, a home waiting to be chosen, the scent of dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun, and the faint, enduring smell of saddle leather and stale coffee clung to Elias Thorne's cabin. Each item in the single room had its place. The cast-iron skillet scoured and hung, the axe leaning by the stacked kindling, the meticulously folded wool blanket at the foot of his narrow cot. Elias moved through his days with the practiced economy of a man accustomed to solitude, each movement a testament to a life lived without excess or oversight. He was a man carved from the land itself, rugged and unyielding, yet within him lay a stillness that spoke of an unspoken yearning. His hands, broad and scarred, were capable of felling a tree or mending a fence, but they held an innate gentleness, too, a carefulness he rarely had cause to exercise. He ate his meals by the single window, watching the horizon blur into the vast, indifferent sky, and the quiet hush of the cabin often felt less like peace and more like an echo of his own isolation. He'd built this life with his own hands, brick by laborious brick, and sometimes, late at night, when the wind moaned through the chinks in the logs, he wondered if he'd built himself into a cage. He was a protector by nature, though he had no one to shield, and his honor was a solitary flame. He often found himself listening to the wind, not just for the weather, but for any change, any whisper that might break the quiet sameness of his existence. It was a habit born of a deep-seated vigilance, a readiness he couldn't quite let go of, even in the absolute peace of his own domain. There were nights when he would wake not from a dream, but from the sheer weight of the silence his hand, instinctively reaching for the warm leather of his revolver before remembering there was no threat within these walls, save for the quiet ache in his own chest. His days were a rhythmic drumbeat of chores, feeding the mare, checking the trap lines, chopping wood, tending the small, stubborn garden. Each task was performed with a methodical precision that left little room for distraction, a way of keeping the world at arm's length. He found a certain stark beauty in this rhythm, a sense of purpose that kept the emptiness at bay. Yet, in the evenings, when the lamplight cast long dancing shadows across the cabin walls, and the fire crackled a low, companionable tune, the quiet would press in, heavy and unyielding. He would sit, whittling a piece of oak, the shavings curling around his calloused fingers, and he would think of nothing or everything, depending on the mood that claimed him. He knew the taste of loneliness, a bitter familiarity, but he had learned to live with it, to make it a part of the landscape of his soul. His only true companion was his mare, Mess, a steady, calm creature with intelligent eyes. He spoke to her sometimes, low rumbling words that seemed to vanish into the vastness of the prairie. Yet he felt a kinship with her that he rarely extended to people. He trusted her, and she, in turn, trusted him, a simple, unspoken understanding that brought a measure of comfort to his otherwise solitary life. He was not an unhappy man, not precisely, but a man unfulfilled, a vessel waiting for something to pour into it, a heart waiting for a purpose beyond mere survival. His world was orderly, predictable, and profoundly, beautifully still. He was, in essence, a blank canvas, waiting for a brushstroke of color, a quiet note to break the enduring, lonesome melody. The notice was pinned to the general store's bulletin board, stark against the weathered wood. Housekeeper wanted. Room and board. Inquire within. Elias paused, his hand on the door, and glanced at it. He rarely paid mind to such things. His needs were few, and his house, sparse as it was, maintained by his own capable hands. But then he saw the small, delicate script beneath, a hurried addendum, widow with child. Desperate, a prickle, unfamiliar and unwelcome, stirred in his chest. Desperate was a word that always held a sharp edge, particularly when it concerned a woman and a child on this unforgiving land. He went inside, bought his flour and coffee, exchanged the customary terse nods with Mr. Henderson, the store owner, and then, almost against his will, found his gaze drawn back to the notice. He had a spare room, unused since his sister had briefly visited years ago. It was small, cold in winter, but it was shelter. He thought of the quiet of his cabin, the overwhelming quiet, and a strange impulse seized him. "Henderson," he rumbled, his voice rough from disuse. "That housekeeper notice. Who is she?" Henderson, a man whose life revolved around the comings and goings of the small town, looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. Elias Thorne rarely asked about anything that didn't directly concern his trap lines or his provisions. "Name's Clara Thorne, Elias. No relation, mind. Her husband, God rest his soul, died last spring. Left her with a little girl, Nell, and not much else. She's been doing odd jobs, mending mostly, but it ain't enough." He watched Elias, a silent question in his gaze. Elias just nodded, his jaw tight. He thought of his own quiet home, the orderly routines, and then of a woman and child, likely hungry, certainly afraid. His moral code, a sturdy, unyielding thing, began to assert itself. He wasn't looking for companionship, he told himself. He was merely offering a practical solution to a practical problem. An arrangement, nothing more. But even as he made the decision, a faint stirring, like the first whisper of spring after a long winter, began in the depths of his being. He found himself imagining a child's laughter echoing through his silent rooms, a woman's soft footsteps on his wooden floors. The image was fleeting, yet potent, disturbing the carefully constructed peace of his solitary life. He would offer her the room, he decided, and work enough to keep them fed. A roof, a meal, and a wage. Simple. Clean. He would make it clear it was a business arrangement. No expectations. He just needed to know where to find her. "Where can I find this Clara Thorne?" he asked, a name feeling foreign on his tongue. Henderson pointed to a small run-down cottage at the edge of town, smoke curling thinly from its crooked chimney. "She's there, Elias. Don't expect much. Hard times. Good woman, though. Proud." Elias nodded again, a flicker of understanding passing through him. Proud. He knew that kind of pride, the kind that held a person upright even when their world was crumbling around them. He would approach her with respect, with an offer of aid, not charity. It was the only way he knew how. Clara Thorne, no relation, as the town quickly pointed out, watched the tall, silent man approach her cottage with a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. He was Elias Thorne, the taciturn trapper, a man more myth than neighbor, known for his isolation and his steady, unsettling gaze. Her hands, calloused from years of hard work, nervously smoothed the apron over her simple dress. Nell, her daughter, a wisp of a child with enormous, observant eyes, clutched at her skirt, peeking out from behind her mother's legs. Clara had seen the notice in the store. She'd even dared to hope, then dismissed it. Elias Thorne hiring a housekeeper? It seemed impossible. He lived like a hermit. Yet here he was, filling the small space of her doorway with his presence, his shadow stretching long across her worn floorboards. He removed his hat, a gesture that was both unexpected and surprisingly gentle. His hair, dark as rich earth, fell across his forehead, and his eyes, a deep, unsettling blue, met hers without flinching. "Ma'am," he rumbled, his voice low and deliberate, like stones shifting in a riverbed. "Mr. Henderson tells me you're looking for work." "And a place," Clara swallowed, her pride warring with her desperate need. "I am, Mr. Thorne, but I understand you live alone." "I have my daughter." She gestured to Nell, who bravely offered a shy half-smile before retreating further into the folds of Clara's skirt. "I have a spare room," he said, ignoring her unspoken hesitation. "It's small, cold in winter, but it's shelter. There's work enough, cleaning, cooking, mending, for a fair wage. And the room for you and your daughter." He paused, his gaze steady. "No charity. It's an arrangement, if you're willing." His words, devoid of pity, struck a chord within her. He was offering her dignity, not a handout. It was a rare, precious thing. She looked at Nell, whose small face was turned up to hers, expectant. "We are willing, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice surprisingly firm despite the tremor in her hands. "When would you want us?" "Tomorrow morning," he replied, without preamble. "Bring what you need." "My place is south of town, by the creek." "You know it?" She nodded. Everyone knew Elias Thorne's place. It was the last homestead before the wildlands truly began. As quickly as he'd appeared, he turned, pulling his hat back on, and walked away, his stride long and unhurried. Clara watched him go, a strange mix of relief and trepidation washing over her. A new beginning, she thought, in a house belonging to a silent, solitary man. It would be an adjustment, certainly, but it was a chance, a roof over their heads, food in their bellies. And for the first time in a long while, the knot in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a cautious flicker of hope. She looked down at Nell, who was now peeking out again, watching the dwindling figure of Mr. Thorne. "Mama," Nell whispered, "is he a giant?" Clara managed a small, shaky smile. "No, little one. Just a very tall man. And he's going to help us." The next morning, the sun was barely peeking over the eastern hills when Elias watched a small, battered wagon creak its way down the track to his cabin. Clara sat on the buckboard, Nell a small bundle beside her, surrounded by a meager collection of trunks and bundles. He met them at the door, his face unreadable. "Welcome, Mom," he said, stepping aside to let them enter. The cabin, which had always felt simply functional to Elias, seemed to shrink under the weight of Clara's presence. Her eyes, a soft, warm brown, took in every detail: the scrubbed floor, the single cot, the small, stone fireplace, the lack of any personal flourishes. Nell, still clutching Clara's hand, stared wide-eyed at the unfamiliar surroundings, her gaze finally settling on Elias's worn, leather-bound book on the table. "This will be your room," Elias said, gesturing to a small lean-to built onto the side of the cabin, separated by a thin wooden partition. It contained a narrow bed, a small, three-legged stool, and not much else. It was stark but clean. "It's not much," he added, almost apologetically, "but it's yours." "It's more than enough, Mr. Thorne," Clara replied, her voice soft but firm. She looked at him directly, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. He was offering safety, and she was accepting it with gratitude and grace, not subservience. Elias then directed her to the kitchen area, indicating the water pump, the wood stove, and the small pantry. "I'll show you the ropes," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "What needs doing?" He demonstrated how to prime the pump, how to gauge the heat of the stove, how to separate the kindling. His movements were precise, efficient, and surprisingly patient. Clara watched, absorbing every detail, her capable hands already itching to begin. Nell, meanwhile, had begun to explore, her small fingers tracing the rough texture of the wooden walls, her curiosity slowly overcoming her shyness. She found a small, smooth stone near the fireplace and carried it to Clara, a silent offering. Elias observed them, a strange, unfamiliar warmth beginning to unfurl in his chest. The cabin, so long a bastion of his solitude, no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. The air seemed to hum with a new energy, a quiet, gentle hum that subtly changed the rhythm of his home. He had prepared for a practical arrangement, but he hadn't anticipated the quiet, profound shift that their mere presence would bring. Clara, with Nell often at her side, quickly established a new rhythm in the cabin. The scent of fresh-baked bread replaced the perpetual aroma of stale coffee. and the clatter of pots and pans punctuated the once unbroken silence. Elias watched her, often from the doorway, his gaze steady and observant. She moved with an innate grace, efficient and purposeful, her hair often escaping its braid in soft tendrils around her face. She mended his shirts, the stitches neat and precise, a quiet testament to her skill. One afternoon, he watched her at the small table, patiently teaching Nell her letters, tracing them with a finger on a worn slate. Nell, usually so quiet, giggled as Clara exaggerated the sounds, and a faint smile, rare and beautiful, touched Clara's lips. It was a sight that lodged itself deep in Elias's mind, an image of quiet domesticity he hadn't realized he longed for. He'd left a shirt on his cot, a tear in the shoulder seam. Later, he found it neatly mended, folded, and placed on his small shelf. He ran a thumb over the precise stitches, feeling a peculiar tenderness. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke volumes. One evening, as the lamplight cast a warm glow across the room, Elias watched Clara pour his tea. She handed him the warmer mug, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that didn't escape his notice. He felt a flicker of something in his chest, a soft warmth that mirrored the heat radiating from the ceramic. He caught her eye, and for a moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them, a quiet acknowledgment of the burgeoning tender trust. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. She simply nodded, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. The ease with which she had integrated herself into his home, not as a servant, but as a quiet, capable presence, surprised him. She was not demanding, nor was she overly familiar. She respected his quiet nature, and in turn, he found himself respecting her resilience, her quiet strength. He noticed the way she always asked before touching something of his, a subtle deference that spoke of a deep-seated respect for boundaries. He, in turn, found himself instinctively asking her if she preferred the door open or closed, the fire higher or lower. They were small exchanges, yet each one was a careful, deliberate building block in the slow, painstaking construction of trust between them. The cabin, once so hushed, now contained a gentle symphony of sound, Nell's soft humming, Clara's quiet movements, the rhythmic chop of wood from Elias, and the steady, comforting beat of their shared existence. One evening, a fierce autumn storm raged outside, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney. Elias sat by the fire, whittling, while Clara read aloud to Nell from a tattered book of fables, her voice a soft counterpoint to the storm's fury. Nell, after a while, drifted off to sleep in Clara's lap. The wind picked up, and a sudden, violent gust ripped through the small lean-to, sending a shower of cold air and dust into the main cabin. Clara shivered, pulling Nell closer. Elias looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "It'll be colder in there tonight," he rumbled, gesturing to the lean-to. "You and Nell can sleep by the fire, on the cot. It'll be warmer." He watched her, waiting. Her eyes searched his, a flicker of hesitation, then a dawning understanding. He wasn't suggesting anything untoward. He was simply offering comfort, protection from the storm. It was a practical solution, yes, but there was a quiet tenderness in his offer. "Only if you want," he added, his voice softer now. "I can sleep by the door." Clara considered his words, his steady gaze. She trusted him. She had seen his honor in every careful gesture, every deliberate action. She also saw the exhaustion in her own face, the deep need for warmth, and a good night's sleep for herself and her daughter. "Thank you, Elias," she said, using his first name for the first time, the sound a soft caress in the quiet room. "We would be grateful." He simply nodded, then helped her move the cot closer to the fire, stoking the flames until they roared a cheerful symphony. He then took his own blanket and made a bed for himself by the door, a clear boundary drawn between them, but one that still offered the comfort of his presence. That night, as the storm raged, Clara and Nell slept soundly, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the quiet presence of the man who had offered them shelter. Clara, just before she drifted off, saw Elias's silhouette by the door, his form a dark, reassuring shape against the flickering lamplight. She felt a profound sense of safety, a feeling she hadn't known in a long, long time. The cabin, once a place of stark solitude, now felt like a haven, a place where trust was slowly, carefully blossoming. Elias, too, found a different kind of peace that night. He listened to the soft, even breaths of Clara and Nell, the rhythmic crackle of the fire, and the fading howl of the wind. His cabin was no longer merely a dwelling. It was a home, warmed by the presence of a woman and child, and by the quiet, mutual choice they had made to trust each other. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in their domestic landscape. Elias found himself lingering longer by the fire in the evenings, drawn by the quiet domestic scene of Clara, mending or reading, Nell, often asleep nearby. They spoke more, not of grand things, but of the day's small happenings, of the changing weather, of Nell's progress with her letters. One afternoon, as Elias was oiling his rifle, Clara sat across from him, mending one of his work shirts. Her needle pricked her finger, drawing a tiny bead of blood. Elias, without a word, reached for her hand, his large thumb gently wiping away the blood before she could even react. His touch was brief, fleeting, yet it sent a jolt through her, a warmth that spread beyond her injured finger. He then reached for a clean strip of cloth and carefully, precisely, bound her finger. His gaze, as he worked, was intense, focused, and held a depth she was only beginning to understand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a little shaky. He simply nodded, his eyes meeting hers, a silent current passing between them. The gesture was simple, yet it spoke volumes of his quiet care, his innate protectiveness. He returned his attention to his rifle, but the air between them had changed, thickened with an unspoken acknowledgment of their growing closeness. He found himself studying her more, noticing the way her brow furrowed in concentration when she was sewing, the soft curve of her smile when Nell said something amusing. He felt a quiet draw to her, a yearning that was both new and profoundly ancient. She, in turn, found herself observing him, the way his muscles flexed as he chopped wood, the quiet intensity in his eyes when he listened. She began to anticipate his needs, a fresh cup of coffee at dawn, a warm meal waiting when he came in from his trap lines. Their domestic proximity, far from being a burden, was slowly weaving them into a fabric of mutual reliance and tender care. One evening, after Nell was asleep, Clara looked up from her mending. "Elias," she began, her voice soft. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You never speak of your past." He hesitated, then sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of many unspoken years. "Not much to tell, Clara. Just a man trying to make his way." He paused, then added, "My family. Gone, a long time ago." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. She understood the unspoken grief, the wounds that never fully healed. Instead, she offered, "Mine too, my husband. He was a good man. But life, it's hard out here, for a woman alone." Her eyes met his, a shared understanding passing between them, a quiet acknowledgment of the losses they both carried. It was a small confession, a gentle opening, but it was enough. The air in the cabin seemed to settle, warm and intimate, around their shared, quiet histories. Their bond, forged in the quiet rhythm of shared domesticity, soon faced its first test. Mr. Silas Blackwood, a prosperous but notoriously boorish rancher from a neighboring spread, began to pay frequent calls. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and he made no secret of his intentions towards Clara. He would arrive, uninvited, with a bottle of whiskey and a booming laugh, his gaze lingering on Clara in a way that made her skin crawl. Elias would watch from the doorway, his posture stiff, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He saw the subtle fear in Clara's eyes, the way she would subtly position herself between Blackwood and Nell. One afternoon, Blackwood cornered Clara by the well, his voice loud, his hand reaching for her arm. "A pretty thing like you, Clara, shouldn't be wasting your time on a quiet man like Thorne. You need a real man, a man who can give you a proper life." Clara pulled away, her face pale, her eyes flashing. "My life is my own, Mr. Blackwood, and I am content where I am." Just then, Elias stepped out of the cabin, his presence a silent, formidable shield. He didn't say a word, but his gaze, cold and unwavering, met Blackwood's. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Blackwood, for all his bluster, was not a fool. He knew the reputation of Elias Thorne, a man whose quietness masked a dangerous strength. He saw the protectiveness in Elias's eyes, the silent warning. With a sneer, Blackwood retreated, muttering curses under his breath, his eyes darting between Elias and Clara. Elias watched him ride away, then turned to Clara, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, his gaze searching hers. Clara nodded, her hand pressed to her chest. "Thank you, Elias. He makes me uncomfortable." "He won't bother you again," Elias stated, his voice devoid of emotion, but with an underlying steel that left no room for doubt. Later that evening, after Nell was asleep, Clara sat by the fire, mending one of Nell's small dresses. Elias sat opposite her, polishing his rifle. The silence between them was different now, weighted with the shared experience of Blackwood's intrusion. "Elias," Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper, "why do you stay here? So far from everything?" He paused his work, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It's my home, what little I have left." He looked at her then, his blue eyes holding a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "And now, you and Nell, you make it a home." Her breath hitched in her throat. His words, simple and direct, were a profound admission, a quiet vow. He was choosing them, choosing to stay, choosing to protect them. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment, then gently covering his, which still rested on the cold steel of his rifle. His fingers, calloused and strong, covered hers, a silent, tender clasp that sealed the unspoken promise between them. The confrontation with Blackwood, though brief, solidified something fundamental between Elias and Clara. It wasn't just a practical arrangement anymore. It was a partnership, a quiet, unyielding front against the harshness of the world. The unspoken understanding between them deepened, morphing into a profound mutual respect and a burgeoning tenderness. One afternoon, as Elias was sharpening his axe, Clara approached him, a small, hand-stitched patch in her hand. "I found this in your mending pile," she said, her voice soft. "Your old work coat. It needs a good repair." He looked at the patch, then at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You don't have to, Clara. It's old." "But it's useful," she countered, her eyes sparkling with a quiet humor. "And it deserves to be mended." He watched her as she sat on the small stool, her needle flashing in the sunlight, mending the tear with practiced ease. The act itself, so simple, held a deeper meaning. She was mending not just his coat, but the quiet, lonely parts of his life, weaving warmth and care into the fabric of his existence. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elias found her by the creek, Nell splashing in the shallow water nearby. He approached quietly, holding a small, smooth piece of river stone he'd found, worn smooth by the current. "Clara," he said, her name a soft murmur on his lips. She turned, her smile warm and genuine. He held out the stone. "For Nell," he said, "a good luck charm." Nell, seeing the stone, ran to him, her small hand reaching for it. He knelt, placing the stone in her palm, his fingers brushing hers. It was a fleeting touch, yet it was imbued with a quiet affection. As Nell scampered off to show her mother her new treasure, Elias looked at Clara. "You and Nell," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "You've brought something back here I thought I'd lost." His eyes, storm blue and steady, held hers without wavering. "A reason to come home at night. A reason to keep going." Clara's breath caught, her fingers tightening on the hem of her dress. She wasn't a woman prone to foolish dreams, but in his words she heard something more than gratitude. She heard a confession, halting and rough-edged, carved out of a man not used to laying bare his heart. She stepped closer, the soft rush of the creek filling the silence between them. "And you've given Nell safety," she whispered. "You've given me peace I didn't think I'd ever feel again." Her hand trembled, but she lifted it anyway, resting it against his arm. "That matters, Elias, more than you know." For a moment, neither moved. The late sun gilded the water, lit the edges of her hair like copper fire. Elias lowered his gaze, as if searching her face for some truth he scarcely dared to believe. "I can't promise much," he said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual steadiness. "I'm no easy man. Don't have fine words. Don't have much of anything, really. Just this land. These hands." He flexed them, scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who knew labor and loss. Then, with quiet certainty, "But they're yours, if you'll have them." Clara's throat tightened. She thought of all the places she'd tried to make a life, of the doors shut in her face, the nights spent praying Nell would sleep through her own hunger. She thought of the first time Elias had offered her tea, the way he'd bound her finger after a prick of the needle, the way he'd stood between her and Blackwood without hesitation. And now this. "You are exactly what we need," she said, her voice firm though her eyes shimmered. "Nothing more, nothing less, just you." Elias let out a slow breath, almost a sigh of release, as though something long clenched inside him had finally eased. He reached up, his touch reverent, and brushed an errant strand of hair from her cheek. His hand lingered, rough palm against soft skin, a fragile bridge built in that single unguarded gesture. Nell, laughing by the water's edge, held the smooth river stone aloft, her small voice carrying on the breeze. "Mama, look," he said, "it's good luck." Clara smiled through the tears pricking her eyes. "So it is, darling." Elias glanced at the little girl, then back at Clara. His voice dropped to a whisper meant only for her. "Maybe it's more than luck." And in that moment, beneath the wide, indifferent sky, beside the creek that had carried stone smooth through years of patient current, a silent covenant was made. Not in grand vows, not in fiery declarations, but in the quiet choosing of each other. Elias Thorne's cabin, once a prison of solitude, had become a home. Not because of the walls he had built, but because of the lives now woven into its silence. A woman with steadfast eyes, a child with laughter like bells, and a man who, at last, had found the purpose he didn't know he'd been waiting for. It began, as all true things do, with a silence filled not by words, but by love.